What would be some other guidelines as we approach the stories of the Gospels and maybe Acts as well, that will help us enter the story, if you will? How do we do that? I mean, how do we try to read the Gospels with fresh eyes so that we really are entering into the story and seeing ourselves as a part of the ongoing story?
Well, one of the steps I would suggest is a little difficult in one sense, in that the more familiar you can get with the background of the story of how it operates in the first century, and there are tools that help with this, the more you can understand how the ancient world is both like and unlike our own world, even though the struggles might be the same. So that's a little harder, but another simple way
Well,
to
well,
do
let me
it,
ask on that. So historical background,
archaeological background. What are houses like? What were houses like? What were the expectations of tax collectors? Were shepherds viewed positively or negatively in the culture? It can be all kinds of things about first century life, first century expectations. For example,
so what would the buzz on the street have been about messiahs?
Exactly right. And the point is that some people think, well, there's only one view out there. Well, actually, you could have had a CNN counterpoint show about the various views on the Messiah in the first century. Some people would have come in and said, oh, he's going to be a king, he's going to wipe out Rome. Other people would have said, no, he's going to come from heaven and crash the party. You know, a third group would have said, now, wait a minute, one Messiah? There are actually two Messiahs. We need a priestly Messiah and a political Messiah. And then the fourth group got, no Messiah at all. Messiahs mess things up. They make things difficult for Israel. So there's a variety of things, which explains why Jesus is so careful about the confession of his being the Messiah, because he can't guarantee when he says the words what actually people will be hearing and thinking when he says it.
It could have been a miscommunication.
Exactly right, unless he's very, very clear, and unless the people talking about him are very, very clear about what his messiahship involves. And one of those mystery elements that they didn't pick up on and that they didn't anticipate in any of those views was the idea the Messiah would suffer. And so when Jesus begins to talk about the kind of Messiah he's going to be, including suffering, he's putting in a wild card that no one anticipated. Now, we could argue they should have anticipated it from a text like Isaiah 53, but they didn't anticipate it, and even the disciples needed instruction on it and were slow to get it. In fact, the first time Jesus said, this is the kind of Messiah I'm going to be, Peter said, no way, and Jesus said back to him, get behind me, Satan, which was not a compliment.
Okay, so first point, we need to understand something about the cultural and historical context to really understand what is going on in the story, the nuances of the story. What would be a second thing?
Well, those are the historical cultural elements, if you will. Now, the second element is the literary element. And the way I like to get at this for people is think about the different characters in stories and what they are going through. Now, this requires that you fill in some literary gaps, but some of them aren't hard. For example, when Jairus comes to ask Jesus to heal his daughter, on the way, Jesus gets stopped. Now, we're told in one of the accounts that she's dying. In Matthew, she's already told in a literary collapse that she's dead. That's one of the ways in which the Gospels can differ with one another in compressing the story. But the key point here is that when Jesus stops to deal with the woman who has the hemorrhage and begins to ask her questions, who touched me, you know, gets a confession out of her, it's a little bit like being stuck in traffic, being late for an appointment that you really want to get to on time. Jairus is probably getting very, very, very frustrated that Jesus, look, you can come back and deal with her. She just had a little bleeding problem. My daughter is dying. And so connecting with the characters in this kind of a way can be helpful. Or another example, when the
Well, let me just ask
Okay.
about that.
Okay.
What you actually have come into the story then is tension.
Exactly right. Significant tension, and sometimes many of the scenes that Jesus deals with are filled with tension because of controversy or something unusual that he's doing, something out of the ordinary that gives pause.
Well, and what is interesting about the story of the woman with the issue of blood is when you go back and you read the Old Testament law, she, in touching Jesus, actually normally would have made him ceremonially unclean.
That's right, and in this case it's the reverse.
It reversed. The
That's
power
right.
goes out of him
Exactly.
and cleanses her
Exactly
instead.
right, and that's part of the picture. I call miracles PowerPoints because they're making points about Jesus' power and authority. And so in that sense, you see how Jesus is working, and you build up these PowerPoints, and the portrait is, in the end, he's got a lot of power and a lot of authority. He's even got authority to forgive sins. Another character example I was going to use is the paralytic. You know, he drops in the room, and Jesus says to him, your sins are forgiven. And I tell people when I teach this passage, this is not in the text, but think about it. What did the paralytic think when Jesus said to him, your sins are forgiven? And what I think he thought was, that isn't why I crashed this party. I didn't come here to have my sins forgiven. I came here to be healed so I could walk out of here. So what are you doing forgiving my sins? And of course, Jesus takes something that you cannot see, forgiveness of sins, and something that only God has the authority to do, and links it to something you can see, making a lame person walk, so that you can know that Jesus has the authority to do something otherwise you couldn't see. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, appreciating the anomaly in a text or the tension in a text, something surprising that happens that opens up the text when you understand the background, and the background in this particular scene is only God has the authority to forgive sins. And the beauty is that we're told that by the people who are complaining about what Jesus is doing. And he says, well, you may not think I have the authority to do this, but in order that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to him, get up and walk. And when he walks out, his walk talks, and it says, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins.
In getting at these stories, we need to enter into that cultural context. Are there tools that can help us with that? You mentioned that we need to understand some about what's going on behind the scenes here. What tools would be helpful for us?
Well, good study Bibles will sometimes mention different aspects of background that are important. There are tools that are like Dictionary of New Testament Backgrounds is a nice book. I believe it's edited by Craig Evans. And this gets into the backgrounds and tells you a little bit about the backgrounds. There are study Bibles dedicated to archaeology that some of the publishers have produced. These also touch on certain aspects of everyday life. Most good commentaries will introduce you to some of this background. They don't have to be super technical as long as they're connected to what's going on in the first century. So there actually are a lot of resources. In the English language, we're blessed with a lot of resources that can help us in this regard.